Welcome to Perino on Politics, where we give you everything you need to know from a 30,000-foot view of this week in politics. Joining me today is the founder and executive director of Power the Future. He's a friend of mine. His name's Daniel Turner, and it's so good to be with you. We are reconnecting after a couple of decades, almost. He was at the State Department when I was Justice Department, White House Council on Environmental Quality, and I think to get started, because one of the things this podcast does is it lets people that listen meet my smart friends. And I try to surround myself with the smartest people. And we're looking at the issue of the environment and energy and how that also, not just the policy of it, which I want to get into, but also the politics of it as well. But before we get started, just tell people a little bit about where you grew up, how you ended up here with me in New York.
Well, first of all, thank you. Thanks for considering me a smart friend. That's quite a compliment. Smart is always a nice thing to be called. I grew up here in New York City.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, I'm a native New Yorker. My family's been here for generations, since basically the revolution.
Wow.
So I'm a born and bred New Yorker, and the accent will come out sometimes.
Okay, I'm hearing it now. Like, we're getting rid of Middleburg, Virginia.
Exactly. And then I've lived in the country now on a sheep farm for the last couple years after leaving Washington, D.C. And I started Power of the Future. I loved energy issues. I always thought energy was incredibly important. When back in the Bush administration, right, we saw what oil prices, what happened with oil prices and what happened with national security and when the Middle East was in conflict. I always loved this issue, but I have a foot in both camps, and that's really why I started the organization. I grew up in the city, and I understand city life, and I understand the way city people think, but now I live in the country, and our energy comes from rural America. And there's a huge disconnect between the people who make energy policy and the people who live energy policy. And it's made by people here, people in New York, people in DC, people in San Francisco. Environmental groups tend to be founded in those big cities. But the men and women who work in oil, gas, and coal and fracking and pipelines, they live in the country. And it's very easy for policymakers in the city to say, well, we're going to shut down that coal mine. We're going to close down that pipeline. And those millions of workers never really have a voice or a seat at the table. And that's why I started the organization, to bridge that divide. One
of the ways that we first met was because on his first day in office, I think it might have even been the first action, President Biden canceled the Keystone Pipeline.
Yeah.
And subsequently, John Kerry told everyone that worked in the industry just to go get a green job.
Yeah.
It was so arrogant.
Yeah.
Right. And so how has that gone?
And it's an industry that we have no problem saying that about, right? We have no problem telling energy workers, well, we're just going to get rid of your job. We're just going to close down your coal plant. Do you remember going back a couple of years, President Obama, when he was Senator Obama, even joked saying, I'm not going to make coal illegal, but I'll tell you this, if you own a coal mine when I'm president, you're going to go bankrupt. And people applauded and said, yay, that's a good thing. But it's not a good thing if you're one of the millions of people who work in coal and these small towns very close to where I live now, where the coal mine is every job. The coal mine is the funding for the school. It's the Little League. On the back of the jersey is the name of the coal mine. It's maybe a town of 4,000 people, but everyone works there. And we've shut down these mines, and we've told the people in those towns, welcome to poverty.
Yeah. And, when I know this much, and my fingers are really close together about energy policy, but more than most, because I cut my teeth on Capitol Hill with the congressman who was the chairman of the Energy Subcommittee at the time. That's when there was one. And then I worked on the White House Council on Environmental Quality. I worked at Department of Justice on all of the environmental and energy legal issues that are going out there, which I know you're familiar with. But then when you start digging in a little bit more of just like how energy powers our economy and the infrastructure that hasn't kept up. We haven't built a refinery since the 1970s. And there's these dreams, these goals of this beautiful utopia of everything being powered by wind and solar, which is not happening. We're not getting there. It's almost amazing to think we don't have more energy, like blackouts or problems. It's incredible to me that the men and women that work in this industry are able to patch things together and keep energy flowing to all of us so that we can have the economy we have.
Yeah, and we are rolling the dice because every year we get a little bit more of a risk of blackouts and brownouts. It's common now in heat waves to get a text from the governor saying, hey, everyone, we're going to recommend you don't do laundry at these periods, these peak periods, because your dryer uses a lot of energy. Governor Newsom would tell people not to charge your cars at night because the electric grid couldn't sustain it. But if you want me to drive an electric vehicle, quite frankly, if you're forcing me to drive an electric vehicle, because combustion engine cars will be illegal in California in 2030, well, then you have to provide the electricity to charge it at night. Because what if my wife goes into labor, right? What if I have to run my kid to the emergency room? What if there's a fire, and California has fires and we need to escape? There has to be an alternative. And you mentioned infrastructure and building. It's one of the things that I always marvel at. And this is not knocking our current administration, which is very easy to do on energy policy. But let's look at two secretaries. Here's the Secretary of the Interior, Deb Haaland, who says, we're going to get rid of oil, gas, coal, fracking. We're going to make it impossible to bring these to production. We're taking away land and access for oil, gas, coal, et cetera. Here's Pete Buttigieg, who says we're going to have the largest infrastructure package in history. We're going to build all these roads and bridges. But you can't make cement without coal. You can't make steel without coal. You can't build any of these things without oil, gas, and coal. And I just wonder, does Secretary Haaland and Secretary Buttigieg ever sit down and talk and say, look, your policies are making it really hard for me to carry out my policies? They are. We're not using less oil, gas, and coal. It's just expensive.
I certainly don't think they talk. And one of the things I'm shocked by is that President Biden rarely has a cabinet meeting.
Yeah.
I mean, a cabinet meeting is a great way for a president to show, I'm in charge. I'm bringing the smart people together. Everyone at the table. I want everyone's best ideas on how to combat anti-Semitism today. Mm-hmm. Or next Monday, everyone's coming in here. We're talking about making sure that we have, well, they would never do this, but in a normal administration, you'd say, we want to make sure we have enough energy to do what we need to do to grow this economy, and in a way that is funding a lot of the great new science that will get us to a cleaner environment. At what point, Daniel, did we end up with the environment and energy becoming a partisan issue? Yeah. I mean, everybody wants a clean environment. There's nobody who's like, yeah, I really would love to, breathe dirty air. We've made so much progress, but it's almost as if on the left, they don't want people to celebrate the progress, or else their idea of this utopia will go away. Yeah,
and it's this binary choice that they want us to believe we have. We either have fossil fuels or we have a clean environment, and that's such a false choice. President Biden talks about how when he was a kid in the 70s or a young man in the 70s, how there was so much soot on cars, you had to wipe them clean. I was alive in the 70s. I don't remember. I certainly wasn't driving. I'll take him at his word. Maybe there was. And I've heard other people tell similar stories, especially. I
lived in Denver, and there were days that were just absolutely terrible. And it's a much better situation today.
That's the point, right? So rather than look at that of saying, look how far we've come, and no, we're using more fossil fuels than ever before, and we cleaned up this air. We don't have these days anymore that you have to wipe the gunk off your windscreen. But Biden tells those stories as if to give us the impression that this is how things still are. Mm-hmm. We don't have a terrible environment in America. We do things very, very well. And quite frankly, the further you depart from fossil fuel economies, the dirtier their nations get. The ones that pollute the most are not the fossil fuel rich America, Canada, Western Europe. The ones that are leading the world pollution are the others. And then what do? Which is where Earth Day becomes kind of funny. We punish ourselves, right? China pumps 90% of the plastic in the ocean. We ban straws. And you say, well, why do we have to give up our straws, right? Why doesn't China have to step up to the plate?
Right. Let's talk about China. I wrote that down here. China, and I put an exclamation point because, they get away with so much on the environment, right?
They do.
And so John Kerry when he was climate czar, would go over and basically say, thank you so much for all you're doing. Like, really? Yeah. All they're doing. They build a coal-fired power plant a week. They don't care.
Yeah.
And we are holding ourselves back from the clean energy that we can produce and letting China eat our lunch. How does that make any sense?
Exactly. And it's one of my frustrations with the politics of energy policy is that we say, we're going to get rid of these carbon-intensive practices because they're bad for the environment. Well, we just offshore them to China, which doesn't have environmental regulations and OSHA, and it doesn't have an EPA to monitor air and water quality. So we're saying, well, we're not going to have coal miners in Wyoming mine coal because that's bad, but we'll allow China to do it poorly. And then ship all the goods back across the Pacific.
That doesn't make sense.
Why is that green? And what are they building? They're building a coal plant per week, as you said, and that's the case. And what they're building is they're building wind and solar and EVs, because there is no wind factory that runs on wind. There's no solar factory that runs on solar. They all run on fossil fuels. So if you can burn coal to make solar panels in China to make electricity in Wyoming, why can't you just burn coal in Wyoming, right? Where we do it cleanly.
I know. My Aunt Patty Sue is in Rawlins, Wyoming, and she sends me these pictures of these wind farm. They've taken over so much land.
Yeah.
And also, the incredible thing about, I know you can tell people more about this, but the wind turbine blades, when they reach the end of their life, which is sooner than you think.
About 10 years.
They don't ever disintegrate. They're just in landfills everywhere.
Yeah. And there's a quote by Thomas Sowell that I often use when I'm talking about these issues. It's just brilliant, as obviously Thomas Sowell is. And he says, there aren't solutions. In economics, there aren't solutions. There are trade-offs. And wind, solar, EVs, this whole green movement is presented like this is a solution to our environmental problems. One, I don't think we have environmental problems, but even playing devil's advocate, okay, we have environmental problems. Well, these aren't solutions, right? Wind and solar and EVs introduce a whole host of new challenges and problems, from how they're produced to the rare earths to the recycling of batteries, right? There's reports of how EVs are so heavy that they actually produce microparticles of plastic and rubber from the tires, because there's that much more weight and that much friction that is producing a new type of air pollution. Well, I'm not saying that the combustion engine is perfect. Fossil fuels aren't perfect. I will be the first to go through all the problems fossil fuels have. But then the environmental movement has to admit that wind and solar and EVs have a lot of challenges and drawbacks. And if you weigh them in the scales of American economy, national security, and just the quality of life we enjoy, they're not an easy, they're not a transition. It's just a failed technology.
And what has happened about either in the current administration, you never hear them talk about the potential and capacity and the great promise of nuclear power, clean nuclear power. No,
and we should have nuclear plants built everywhere. I mean, micronuclear reactors, because electricity, we know how to make electricity. I mean, when Edison lit up New York, I mean, not far from where we were, and what was it, I'm going to get the date wrong, sorry, but when he lit up the New York Times building, and if anyone has seen this show, The Gilded Age, they actually have an episode about it, right? And everyone came to watch. We had never seen light come on. We've seen darkness, but that was the first time in the history of mankind that we saw light at nighttime. And it must have been a marvel, and we take it for granted. But we've been making electricity for a long time. We know how. It should be so abundant, so much an afterthought. And as you said earlier, why has it become so weaponized? Why has it become so politicized or partisan? Like, electricity shouldn't be a complicated issue. We've been doing it for so long, but we've made everything political. And it just,
so also, what about the fact that I just feel that from the regulation standpoint, that we as Americans are being nickel and dime to death, right? Yeah. And I'm talking about taking away gas stoves and taking away this or that. I can't stand it that the dishwasher takes 3 hours to run and the clothes aren't getting clean, and people just feel like, again, they want a clean environment, but you're not getting it from those little things that are nickel and diming people to death.
No, and those are the positions that if you are in politics or you want to make some sort of grandiose statement and you say, we pass new stringent regulations on the dryer industry, and you say, great, I have a smart dryer. I joke about it with my husband all the time that we have to, it's smart. It beeps and says it's dry, and you stick your hand in and you're like, everything is damp. So you have to turn it on again.
And then you turn it on again, and like 3 seconds later, it's like, actually, no, your clothes are dry.
Clothes are dry.
Oh my gosh.
Smart dishwashers, smart. And so when do we go back to the folks that push these regulations? If you recall Gina McCarthy, I don't think she's with the Biden administration anymore, but she was Obama's EPA administrator as well. She talked about how we have hundreds of new regulations on appliances. I didn't know she was an expert at appliances, but obviously she is, and she passed all these regulations. But did we actually accomplish what the goal was? You know, do we accomplish what we call energy efficiency? Because if you're using it twice, you're not really saving energy.
No, it doesn't make sense.
No.
The other thing I wanted to touch base with before we get to more of the politics in the next segment, which is everything the Obama team does, the Biden team does, and now at our schools everywhere, it's so all just about climate change, right? And it's become a catch-all term for absolutely everything. They can blame everything on global warming. They can blame everything is for climate change. And it's just become I think, really watered down in terms of a persuasive issue.
It has. It has. And there's a lot of fear in the climate movement. And that's kind of a technique to keep people afraid.
Scare
tactics.
people.
Yeah, you have to scare people that climate change is going to come get you. Right? Even the movies are all apocalyptic. The climate change is coming.
That one with Leonardo DiCaprio was horrendous. What was that called? That was on Netflix. Oh my gosh. So everybody at home is screaming up the answer to me.
I can't think of the name.
It was so bad that I just couldn't believe it. I felt like I was watching a parody, but it really is interesting. Like they just talk about climate all the time.
Yeah.
And if in the polls overall, you do see, especially younger people, they want the president to do more on climate change, right?
Yeah.
Like he's upside down or underwater on so many issues. And one of them is on climate, but it's because they think he's not done enough. Yeah,
exactly. And so here's a message for those who have young folks at home, kids, and they come back from their lesson and they say, we learned all about, especially on today, Earth Day, we learned all about climate issues and we have to do more as a family. Great. Outside of the HVAC system, the number one driver of electricity and energy in most homes now is gaming systems. So will you give up Fortnite? Right? Will you give up? In Wyoming, outside of Cheyenne, they are building a data center that will use more electricity than the city of Cheyenne.
Oh my God!
And its whole purpose is for the Microsoft Call of Duty.
Just for that?
Just for Call of Duty.
Not for because I've heard about, maybe you could talk just a moment about all the electricity that's needed in order to power the AI revolution.
All that requires tons of it. So, but we're
not building any more of it.
Well, we're not making enough reliable electricity, but we're building data centers left and right. Where I live in Virginia, we're building data centers all the time. There's huge tax incentives that we're always promised that's going to be great for the county. All we know is that they use a boatload of energy. I mean, every time you use your phone and you say, oh, I don't want to say it because I don't want your phone to go off. Every time you say, hey, SIRI, like, how do I get to this restaurant? Right? That requires energy. It requires a ton more energy than you pulling up the yellow pages and finding the name of the number of the pizzeria yourself. Right? So all of our lifestyle is energy intensive now. And that's just the way things, you want to stream a movie, right? Rather than go to the theater.
So is
energy.
Microsoft in building the call center or the data center, excuse me, will they also build power on top of that?
That's a wonderful question for the governor. Or the people of Cheyenne just going to get stuck with higher rates because are you building another new? I mean, I think Bill Gates is one of the ones leading the charge saying that they're trying to link Bitcoin mines with small nuclear. Because he realizes this is the way technology and currencies are going. I'm not a huge crypto
do not come to me for crypto information at all.
I don't really get it. But he understands that it's energy intensive, and he's trying to link the two. Holy cow, smart solution. But going back to the young people, right? What can we do about climate change? Because they've been conditioned to be petrified of climate change. Remember those kids in Senator Feinstein's office a couple years ago?
They're at the airport.
Horrible. Like, you felt bad for those kids.
They ambush her at the airport.
Yeah. 8 and 9 and 10 years old, legit. That's, first of all, that's wrong to do that to a child for any reason at all, but especially on climate change. But what can young people do? Well, great. If you give up the gaming, that's something for the environment. Will you give up Uber Eats, right? How many young people, especially in a city like New York, will hit the Uber app and you say, I just want something delivered. I don't want to walk to the pizzeria. I want it brought to me.
Wow.
That's electricity.
It might take a crisis for people to wake up. But I don't want that, but it might take place.
I don't want a crisis at all. And I'm afraid that's where we're headed. But I know Americans, and they do like their livelihood.
Stuff.
Right? We like our conveniences. We like, and we're not going to make those sacrifices willingly unless you're forced. And that's the ban on gas stoves, the ban on, they will force the behavior they want from you. But boy, that's not really a free country anymore.
And they're doing it by regulation, not legislation, which is sneaky and not great.